economic change. So again, if you just reflect on the changes, and there have been many of them, so I'm not going to be touching upon every little change. I'm going to highlight 3 of them. The first change was with respect to supply side reform. So we have engineered major changes on the supply side. We have lowered corporate taxes, we have implemented GST, we have implemented the Real Estate Regulation Act, we have implemented the IBC, and we have enhanced our infrastructure. We actually did some work last week, which is still work in progress, but it showed that per capita infrastructure in India today is now ahead of China in many sectors, like airports, like railways, like, a little less so in the case of ports. But we have had dramatic shifts that have happened in a very short period of time in a long duration sector like infrastructure. So port turnaround times have reduced, the travel time on roads is reduced, therefore inventories in the pipeline have reduced. Business has become genuinely easy. I concur with Dr. Bala that it is not easy to do business in India, but it's a lot easier than it was 10 years ago. And I think all of you will agree with that. So the delta matters, even though the absolute level is still not satisfactory, and it should never be satisfactory. We should always strive for improvement, but I think we're getting there. Then, of course, all the tax law changes that have happened. We've seen the effect of GST. It has certainly reduced leakages in the system. It has probably reduced corruption. It has increased revenue collection for the government, which then makes it easier for the government to deliver services to citizens. It becomes easier for the government to ensure that there's greater equality in the system. And this idea about equality actually in economics is not a social concept. It's not coming out of socialism or communism. It actually came in the 1930s by a US economist by the name of Kenneth Arrow. So I don't know how many of you know about Kenneth Arrow, but he received a Nobel Prize for writing this piece about how capitalism can succeed, because capitalism invariably produces extreme outcomes. So very few number of people become very rich. The rest of the society gets left behind. I mean, this is the problem that communism was trying to solve and failed, because states tend to be corrupt and therefore communism failed. But capitalism, succeeds only, according to Kenneth Arrow's seminal paper, if governments can transfer money or transfer cash or in kind to the people left behind so that they have a chance in the race to becoming materially rich. And this is about if I am in a 100-meter dash against the world champion, there's no way I'm going to be able to win the race. If I get a 30-meter head start, I will still lose, but the race will become interesting. So that was the idea behind Kenneth Arrow. Now, government after government, country after country has tried to do this, has tried to distribute and undertake social transfers, but it's not been a very successful endeavor. Unintended consequences happen. The latest one in COVID, when the US government tried to help poor people who were getting affected by COVID because of loss of jobs and transferred $800 cash into their bank accounts every month. What they've been left with now is, rampant inflation, for which, the Fed has to raise interest rates at the fastest clip in almost 40 years. And who knows what that is going to now cause in the US economy. India, by the way, didn't go down that path because we had India Stack. So we actually transferred QR codes, which allowed poor people to encash in terms of grains rather than cash. In fact, I was privy to a conversation from a bureaucrat who said that the Prime Minister had met several experts just around the time of COVID. And after those meetings had famously told the people in the government that, and this is way back in March 2020, so imagine the insight that he got from something that was totally unknown. We had no idea what COVID was going to do to us. We only could guess, and even our best guesses were probably going to be wrong. And he had famously said that ये जो बीमारी है, ये अमीर की छाती पे वार है और गरीब की पेट पे लात है. तो हमें गरीबों को खाना देना है और अमीरों के लिए अस्पताल बनाना है, और यही करना है बस। लोग तो मरेंगे, वो तो हम जितने कम मरते हैं उतना अच्छा है। So this is the insight that he had, and that is why India has not had the inflation problem that the rest of the Western world particularly has been facing, because we actually had a much better system of social transfers. So social transfers, are important, and that is something that we have done very well. But this whole supply side reform is I think the basis for the improved growth rate that India is likely to experience. The second big change that has happened, this happened in 2015, and that was flexible inflation targeting. So if you go back to prior to 2015, the central bank in India did not have a mandate. It basically followed what the government of the day asked it to. So if the government of the day said, get me growth, the central bank would cut interest rates. If the government of the day said, control inflation, the central bank would raise rates. In 2015, the Prime Minister changed that. He said that the central bank should have only a single mandate, and the mandate should be to control inflation. And the target will be fixed by the parliament. And the governor of the RBI will be answerable to the floor of the house if the RBI misses the target. This was a massive change in India's economic management. And this was coming out of the 2013 mini crisis that India faced, when all that Ben Bernanke, the then US Fed chair, had to say was taper, and the Indian currency was down 20% in a month. And stock markets were down 20%. And there was almost a crisis that we faced, and we had to raise interest rates by 200 basis points overnight. And the reason was that India was running a twin deficit which was unmanageable. We were running an inflation rate that was well into double digits. So with that experience in the bag, I think this inflation targeting, which we have, which we actually introduced about 8 years ago, has been a very big shift for the country's economy. Now the consequences of this is that we are running macro stability like we've never seen before. And macro stability in economics is essentially you have benign inflation and good growth rates. And as a result, you run a much lower deficit with the world. So if you look at our current account deficit, it's much more manageable because we don't have these imbalances that are there. And our currency actually, of course, a lot of you will look at it as a US dollar cross, but remember the US dollar is doing this. And India is actually faring very well against non-US dollar currencies because of the fact that we have pursued flexible inflation targeting. The third big change was what I term as the 401k moment for India. So way back in 1980, the US President Ronald Reagan allowed 401k plans, which were retirement plans for US employees, to invest in equities. Until then, 401k plans did not invest in equities. What happened in the subsequent 20 years was that US households invested massive sums of money into the US equity markets. And of course, the US equity market went through a big bull run. It formed the basis for the formation of many, many businesses. The entire tech ecosystem got created in that period because capital became a lot cheaper. Again in 2015, for the first time in India's history, we allowed the retirement funds to invest in equities. So provident funds and national pension schemes started investing in equities. And that has formed the basis for a big shift in the allocation of household balance sheets. So if you go back to 2015, 5% of household balance sheets in India were in equities, 12% in gold, 50% in property, and the rest of it in fixed deposits and insurance and other fixed income securities. So imagine gold was 2.5 times more than equities. And gold is really a wasting asset. Yes, it may appreciate in value, but in fact, I don't even call gold an asset. To me, an asset is something that yields. A bond is an asset. It gives you a coupon. An equity is an asset. It gives you a dividend. Property is an asset. It gives you rent. Gold gives you nothing. It's just store of value. But there was great affinity in this country for store of value because we were always very nervous about our currency, we were nervous about inflation, and therefore households in India tended to buy a lot of gold, and that was a wasting asset. It did not produce anything, it just sat there and did nothing for you. It stored value for sure, but it produced nothing. That has started to change now. And this is a huge shift in the productive dynamics of this country. Yes, we have very good demographics. We've always enjoyed good demographics, for the last 70, 80 years. We've had a young population. The population has been young for a really long time, but it's not yielded dividends in terms of growth or prosperity like economics would have predicted. In economics, demographic is a necessary factor for producing prosperity, but it's not sufficient. What you need to put on top of it is productivity, and that's the change. And in fact, what Dr. Bala spoke about is another dimension about productivity, is that if you lift the productivity in the government sector, and if you lift productivity in the social sector, and if you lift it in the private sector, you get a massive surge in productivity overlaid on strong demographics that India has. You basically generate much better growth. So I think we are set up for that now because of the change in which saving is happening in India, which is more productive saving is taking place with equity markets grabbing greater share of household balance sheets, which will then get funneled into startups, which will get funneled into risk enterprises, and that creates growth. So these are three big mega changes that have happened in economics. Again, as I said, there are so many of them. We've written a detailed report about how many changes have happened. I can't cover all of them, but I thought I'll focus on the top three.